The Tarrant County Master Gardener Association has partnered with the Tarrant Regional Water District to encourage water conservation. TRWD maintains 4 area lakes and pipelines needed to provide surface water to local water treatment plants so they can clean that water to meet drinking standards for our communities. They also work with many cities in Tarrant County, such as Fort Worth, Arlington, Mansfield, and many others, to provide water conservation programs to the community. Conservation is an important water supply strategy to help meet the needs of our growing population. There are currently 2.3 million people living in Tarrant County, and this is expected to double over the next 50 years. At SaveTarrantWater.com, you can sign up for free weekly watering advice custom to your location. If you're a resident of Tarrant County, you can sign up for a free sprinkler's checkup where a licensed irrigator comes to your home, provides a comprehensive evaluation of your system with recommendations to reduce water waste. There's also an event calendar where you can find information about future classes and workshops. So be sure and check out SaveTarrantWater.com to sign up for their free services.
Okay. I'm going to talk about the plants that can grow well in this area, mainly native plants with a few non-native plants. And I'm just going to touch on this topic because there's a whole lot more out there, and I hope this will get you interested in more than just what I'm presenting here tonight. But before we get started on that, I want to mention that there are some invasive plants out there that cause problems in natural areas and agricultural areas. And as you can see from this slide, it costs us taxpayers a lot of money. So if you're not sure if something is invasive, you can go to this website, texasinvasives.org, and they have a list of all the ones in Texas that are considered invasive. There may be more put on in the future because there seems to be a lot more coming in wild areas than before and taking over. These are 2 of the worst in this area, privet and Japanese honeysuckle. The privet will get into wild areas, and because it's so prolific, it will become a monoculture and shade out anything new coming up. So the old trees that are there will still stay there, but anything new or understory stuff will be eliminated after a while. And it doesn't take too long for this to start coming in. And of course, Japanese honeysuckle, I'm sure y'all are very familiar with this. In a lot of old landscapes, this was pretty prevalent because it smells great. And as a kid, I'm sure some of y'all did this too. You get those little blooms and suck the nectar out of it because it was sweet. And it's really pretty and smells great, like I said. And the same thing with privet, which is why it was put in our landscapes long ago. And back then we didn't know that it was going to be a problem. But still, it's being sold. So make sure that you check that you don't get anything that might be causing any problem like this. Okay, and now for the fun stuff. I'm going to talk about native plants that go well in your garden that you don't have to do as much to as exotic plants and don't require near as much water. Okay, these are the groups I'm going to be talking about. Ornamental trees, shrubs, and shrub-like. You can read what's here. So I'll go on to the first part. Ornamental trees. Now, what is an ornamental tree? Usually they're understory trees. They're not near as big as shade trees. And they're there for their looks. I mean, that's why people buy them. But they're also good for our native species of insects and animals. First, I use the iconic redbud. Most of us have seen that. It's blooming right now, as a matter of fact, around town. But did you know that there's more than one redbud? A lot of us are familiar with the eastern redbud. You can see the leaves down here on the bottom in the middle. That has a large heart-shaped soft leaf, and it likes a little bit more moisture than the others. So you need to make sure you put it in a place where more water gets to it. Now the Texas redbud up there in the upper left-hand corner, that needs a lot less water. The leaves, as you might be able to tell from the picture, are waxier. They're a little bit smaller. They're more rounded, have a slight curl to the edge. And it can take a lot less water than the Eastern redbud. So you can consider that when you're picking out one. And even more drought tolerant is the Mexican redbud, which it has a similar look to it with rounded heart-shaped leaves. They're a little bit smaller even than the Texas redbud and with that waxy surface. Then there are also a lot of hybrids of these that either are hybridized on their own or there might be in a nursery. So when you check out to get a redbud, make sure you're getting the one that's right for your site. Another tree that's either been blooming right now or just finishing blooming is the Mexican plum. It's got those beautiful, fragrant white flowers that attract all these insects and bees, which of course they're insects, but not just the honeybees, but a lot of the native bees, which are also important. So that's important for our pollinators at this time of year because there are not as many things blooming right now. So this really provides a lot of nectar for all these insects that need nectar, as well as the redbud also helps in that regard. Then later on, it'll have these lovely plums that turn an orangey, yellowish orange color. They're small plums and very tart. They're great for mammals and birds. And humans like to make jelly and syrups and wine out of them. But there's a great understory tree. Then we have Yaupons that have these wonderful berries on them in the fall. They don't have, the flowers on them are pretty minuscule, so you don't have much as far as a show there. But it's a great plant, as it's evergreen, so you can have that as a cover for birds and other critters in the winter. And then you have this lovely show of berries in the fall. Now, a lot of people will hedge these, and that's okay, but it doesn't allow you to really see the berries as well when it's hedged. And it's not as good for wildlife because they view a hedge like a wall and will not use it as readily as they do if you leave it in a more natural shape. Then there's the Possum Holly, which is like the Yaupon, except it has larger leaves, but it's deciduous. So in the fall, it will have the berries and leaves on them, but then when it starts to get colder, they lose their leaves. And then you see that striking red berries or orange that comes in yellow to orange berries. So that you should be aware of. Both the Yaupon and the Possum Holly come in either male or female. So if you want berries, you need to make sure that you get a female. And this is the Mexican Buckeye. Looks kind of similar to the redbud at first glance, but you can look at those flowers. They look kind of like tiny little orchids. And this is another great understory tree, but it will get pretty tall, up to 30 feet, but I haven't seen any in this area that is that tall. It also has these interesting seed pods you can see down here on the lower right that are tri-lobed, and in each one of those little lobes is this bright, shiny seed that look kind of like a black pearl. I find that very interesting. And this is a beautiful plant that is not used enough in this area. It's called the red buckeye. You see those beautiful blooms. It's just starting this time of year to put out those blooms, and it has these palmate leaves. It's just a lovely tree, but this one will go dormant if in the middle of summer when it gets really hot. If you want to keep it green, then you'd have to add water, but why bother with that? It'll just come back in the fall. And so what I mean goes dormant, it loses all its leaves, but it comes back, like I said, in the fall. And here's Eve's necklace. And why it's called that is because of the seeds. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see that string of seeds that looks kind of like a black pearl necklace. And those wisteria blooms, it comes in that pale pink to darker pink and almost white bloom. So this one's a great one. And it smells just wonderful. And then there's a desert willow. This one needs full sun, whereas all the others that I've mentioned so far will take shade to full sun and better on the shadier side. But this one likes full sun. It needs hardly any water. In fact, if you give it too much water, you'll kill it. But it has these lovely blooms, again, that comes in a paler, almost white pink to the deeper color you see in this picture. And it has these bean-like seed pods. There is a variety, I believe it's called Bubba, that will not produce a viable seed. So if you don't want little ones coming up, you can get that one. Now, rusty blackcock, you heard Teresa mention Molly Holler. This is her favorite shrub. It has these beautiful viburnum flowers that you can see on the right here in the spring. And then it will have these berries that come that start with a little bit of a reddish tone to them, and then they turn almost black to deep purple to almost black. And this is also great. All these plants that I'm talking about are great for pollinators. Just say that right now. Then in the fall, it turns these beautiful red rusty color to a kind of a, if it's in more shade, it'll be more mauve colored, has a little bit more purplish color to it. But it is a wonderful fall color. And I know a lot of people don't think we get much fall color here, but this one would prove them wrong. Oop, I went to the wrong one. Then we have the Texas mountain laurel. Its native area is closer to the hill country, but it does well here. And it's evergreen, has these glossy leaves to it. It's just a beautiful plant. It can take some shade, but the more sun it gets, the more it flowers, like almost any other plant. You give it more sun, it can flower more. But what's also great about this, kids love it too because it smells like grape Kool-Aid when it's blooming. It's just a very striking scent. And as you can see by the seeds, those are interesting as well because it has these bright red bean seeds that come on after they bloom. Okay, now shrubs and shrub-like plants. This is a great plant if you have a teenager and you don't want them sneaking out of the house, put it underneath their window. This is a native Mahonia. It has very sharp points on it, and when they're dry and drop off, they're even sharper. But it's a great plant for, as I said, it's evergreen, and it has these beautiful yellow flowers fairly early in the spring that are kind of waxy and have a very strong sweet scent for our pollinators to get attracted to. And then it berries into these red berries like you see on the right here. It's also great for making jam. And you may say, how in the world do you gather those? Because it's such a sharp plant. But stick an umbrella under that plant and knock it open it and knock it with a stick, and all the ripe berries will fall into it. But this is another beautiful plant. Then for a more standard plant that we have is the Yaupon, dwarf Yaupon holly. It's like the big holly, but it was selected for a dwarf. So it would grow along as a shield or hedge. You can see where it's been hedged up in the right-hand corner, but I don't like it that way personally, because a lot of times it gets hedged too closely, and you can see where it just doesn't look as nice, in my opinion. I like it better to let it grow in a more natural shape, and it stays pretty compact. You don't need to trim it unless you have a stray branch coming out. And the one that you can see on the bottom right has not been pruned, and that is probably about 15 years old there. It's about 4 feet tall. And this is another little shrub that is great for birds because they love the little chilies on it, chili pekin. It is one of the native chilies that a lot of our chilies that we buy in the grocery store was used to produce. So it attracts a lot of birds, mockingbirds, and just a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, I noticed a bunch of bluebirds coming in February and eating all the chilies off of it. As you can see, the leaves drop off, but the berries stay through the winter. I usually trim it after mid-February to the ground, and just a few inches above the ground, and then it starts fresh. A Flamencanthus, it's great hummingbird bush, and also cover like that little anole you see there. So it has these beautiful little tubular flowers that attract hummingbirds, which comes in colors of yellow, orange, or red, variations in between. And you can keep it trimmed back so it's more compact, or you can let it grow to its full potential, which is about 5 feet. But the more you trim it back, the more blooms you're going to get. But my brother, what he said he does is trims it back until he starts seeing the little buds come, which is in mid-June. And here's the white honeysuckle bush. Again, another fragrant shrub. It's evergreen or semi-evergreen. It loses some of its leaves and doesn't look full of leaves in the winter, but usually it has quite a few leaves, and then it blooms in the spring. And you can keep this to a smaller size by trimming it, but it's kind of a viney shrub, but you can just trim those stray vine branches to where you want them. And not a lot of people are very familiar with this one, and it's kidney wood. It really attracts the pollinators. I can go to it in the spring when it's blooming, or the summer when it's blooming, and it's just buzzing with bees and all kinds of other insects. And it has these little leaves that are, I can't think of the name right now, but you can see in the picture, it kind of reminds me of mimosa and that, but they're smaller. And this is very, very drought tolerant, doesn't like a lot of water. And I'm sure most people are familiar with Texas sage, also called cenizo. And there comes in dwarf varieties, into standard size. Now, I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but dwarf does not mean it's little. It just means it's smaller than the standard size. So when you pick out one and it says dwarf, check on the tag to see how large it gets. Even the dwarf ones get up to about 5 feet. And these are different varieties here. It comes with, some come with a much darker green leaf, like green cloud. And then you have the old-fashioned one, which is a more silvery gray leaf. And the flowers come from a paler lavender to a much deeper lavender. And this also is extremely drought tolerant, does not like a lot of extra. Oh, and I just noticed I put the wrong name there for the botanic name. I apologize for that. It's right now I can't think of the botanic name, but I'll have to correct that. Okay, this is a bush that can get quite large. It says 3 to 6 feet on spread. I've seen it spread even more than that. It does like a little bit of moisture, so this is one that's good in moisture places. A good foundation plant, because usually you have to water your foundation in this area, so that's good for it. And in the fall, it has these just incredible purple berries, or you can also get it in the white or the pink. Most often you find the purple berries, and you can even use these for decorating. If you pull off the leaves, then the branch with the berries will last a long time, and you can use it in a flower arrangement if you so choose. But this is usually stripped before spring, but sometimes the berries will stay if it's not eaten. But I love this plant. And I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with this one, autumn sage. It smells great when you rub its leaves. And it comes in so many different colors. It's evergreen. It's a nice foundation plant. And when everything else is dead, looking sad, this will at least have some green color to it. And it blooms, has a huge flush of bloom in the spring, then again in the fall, and then sporadically blooms during the rest of the growing season. And as you can see up there in the right-hand corner, that is a native bee called the mason bee. And it doesn't sting, so if you ever see one of those, don't worry about getting in its way. This is native to Mexico rather than here, but it's a great one here. Again, very drought tolerant. It can get quite large and smells great, attracts a ton of butterflies and hummingbirds. I've seen both hummingbirds and butterflies just cover it. And one thing I like about this plant is just gently rubbing the flowers. It's like velvet. Then this is Wright's Skullcap, the one with the purple flowers. This is a native for here. And it can get, it says for the height, when I've researched this, to spread 1 to 1.5 feet. But this particular one that I pictured got quite large, about at least 2 feet across. And it has these purple little blooms. And then after it blooms, a flush of bloom, you can trim it back. It will encourage more blooms and keep it more compact. And it is also evergreen. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the non-native pink skullcap. It's very similar to that, but much larger. And the pink skullcap does well here too, but it is not native. It's a hybridized plant. Okay, this is a great summer blooming plant. It has these wonderful, very, very fragrant trumpet-like blooms that blooms in the evening and will stay open all night. And then when the sun comes out in the morning, if it's a cloudy day, it'll stay open longer. But they'll only last the one day, but there's always new blooms coming along. And you can see by this that bees really go after it. I've been out in the evening admiring some of these, and one day I the blooms, when they just start open just about sundown, and they slowly open, and I've seen bees hitting on the bloom, waiting for them to open up, just anxious to get that nectar. It's quite a sight. And they smell kind of like a lemon, and I can smell it way across a field. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, the Turks Cap. If you don't know it by name, I'm sure you've seen it around town somewhere. And as you can see, hummingbirds love it. This is a plant that goes well in the shade. It blooms well. This is the picture on the far left is mine in my yard, and it gets full shade, no direct sun at all. And then the one in the middle is out at our Molly Holler Wildscape in direct sun. It gets full sun, and it tends to grow taller in the sun, and the leaves are a little bit different color. They're not as dark green as it is in the shade. And in the shade, it kind of lays down a little bit. But it's a great plant to have around for the hummingbirds. And Texas Lantana. I used to think this was the only native lantana, but there are a couple of others. But this is the one that most people get for their yards because it blooms and forms a nice shrub. And you can see it does attract plenty of insects. Now, if you see there are other lantanas that do well here, but there's one that you should not get. Here, I wanted to show you this one first. These are some of the other colors you can get. And a lot of them, there's some annual lantanas that have pretty colors. And then there's this new wave gold that you can see in the middle of the slide. That is a lower growing lantana. But there's all kinds of colors out there. But the one that you don't want to get is this one, Lantana camera, because it's on the invasive list, and it gets very large. This is the first one I was ever familiar with as a kid, and I would pretend that those little blossoms were my Barbie's bridal bouquet. But it was used in the trade, the nursery trade, so it got to be a lot of different places. And when it berries, it has these little black berries that birds can just take off, just like the privet and other invasive plants. So please be aware not to get this one. Okay, this is a great plant because it blooms so much in the middle of the heat. And it's called yellow bells, but it comes in orange as well, and some other colors that are similar. And it's just a profuse bloom. And it can get fairly tall. You can see 9 feet. I haven't seen one 9 feet, but it can still get pretty tall. And there are some that are more not drought tolerant. These are drought tolerant, are more winter tolerant, freeze tolerant. And I believe the orange ones, not all necessarily, but there are orange ones that can take the cold a lot better than the yellow one. So you might check with your nurseryman to see which ones can take the cold better when you go look for one for yourself. And this is not native, but it does very well here. There's the bird of paradise, and it comes in several colors, from this yellowish color to a bright orange to a red. And the way you trim it is going to affect its shape. But the one on the left, you can see it's more open. It probably has not been trimmed as much as the one on the right, but it's extremely drought tolerant. Once it gets established, you probably can just forget about it. Now, grasses. There's more to grasses than just turf. But speaking of turf, this is a native turf grass mix. It has 3 different grasses, mainly buffalo, and it only grows to about 6 inches. So if you don't want to mow it, it's well within that range that the city would get after you. Now, in this picture, The runners haven't been cut as of yet, but that's easy to do with a line trimmer. So, but this will stay green most of the growing season without water. But if you want to keep it green during the hottest part of the year, then you do need to add water to it, maybe once a week, as long as it's a deep watering. But that's one thing I like about it. You don't have to water it once, twice a week, all the time. It will stay green for a long time without having been watered. And you, like I said, you don't have to mow it, but you can. And it looks just like Bermuda grass when it's mowed. This other grassy-like plant that you see to the right of it is something called sedge. And I'll get to one of those in a moment. Now this is what's called big muley or Lindheimer's muley. It is the biggest native muley we have, bunch grass. And most of the year it looks like that top right-hand picture, which is just a nice bunch grass. I like to think of it as a small pampas grass, but the leaves are much kinder than pampas grass. If you're familiar with pampas grass, it has a serrated edge that if you run your hand across it, it can cut you. This will not do that. It's only slightly serrated and it's slightly rough, but it doesn't cut you. Then in the fall, it develops these beautiful plumes. And you can see two pictures where on the one on the right on the bottom was just after a rain. So the plumes are kind of bowing down, but it looks wonderful, especially backlit. And here's another muley. It's a bit smaller. It's called Gulf muley. Oh, again, I made another mistake. Forgot to change the name up there. That this is Gulf muley, not Lindheimer's muley. And in the fall, instead of those white plumes on the Lindheimer's muley, you see these beautiful pink, fluffy cotton candy plumes. And when it's backlit, it's just spectacular. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of that, but it is quite wonderful. And here's another native grass, our Indian grass. And it looks pretty much like this, the middle picture most of the year, bluish green leaves. And then it has these golden inflorescence in the fall, which looks like gold when the sun's shining through it. And you can have this as a specimen plant where you have just one in your garden, or you can make a really big statement if you have the room and put a whole big area of this where you can see it backlit either in the morning or in the evening. Now, ground covers. And I want you to think of ground covers as a plant that will take over a large area, not necessarily just a plant that's low growing and takes over a large area. Okay, because this is a plant that's a shrubby plant that is considered a ground cover, but as you can see, it can get up to 5 feet tall. It's called a coral berry. And it's a very airy plant. It's deciduous. The flowers are insignificant, so you don't really see them. But the berries are what you really enjoy in the late fall and throughout winter. It's one of the last berries that any animal will eat. So it stays on for a long time. And sometimes the berries will still be there when the new leaves come out in early February. It comes out with leaves very early. And you can see that little praying mantis at the top. So it's great cover for praying mantis and other little critters. It's great for larger animals to hide in too. The green expanse that you see on the left, that never gets extra water. It is only watered during rain. And that picture was taken in the middle of a dry spell last fall or last summer. Scarlet Sage, it's a great, one of the many sages we have available. And it will proliferate in a yard. So don't consider this a specimen plant because it can take over a flower bed. But it's great as a ground cover. And you can leave it to its natural size, which is about 2 to 3 feet. Or you can use a line trimmer and keep it at about 1 foot, and that also encourages more blooms, which hummingbirds and butterflies love. And this also comes in a pink variety or kind of a peachy pink, but that's harder to find in the nursery. But if you like that color, it's well worth looking for it. It is also, the peachy color is not as prolific as the scarlet color. And there's wild petunia or violet Ruella. It is, as one of all the other Ruellias, has this purple, anywhere from a lavender to a deep purple. This is the color of the violet Ruella. So, and it looks like a petunia, even though it's not in the petunia family. It attracts a lot of different pollinators. That picture up there is not a bee, but it's a hummingbird moth. But I found it very interesting. Then you can see over here on the left, that's what it looks like when it's not blooming. It gets fairly tall, but then when it gets too tall, then it just kind of lays down a little bit. But it makes a great ground cover that you can mow. And if you do mow it, I would mow it at your highest setting. And it's easy to take care of. Primrose, pink evening primrose, favorite of mine. It should be considered a ground cover because it will cover a large area. The picture on the lower right is where that homeowner keeps it in that area and mows it, and then it'll produce blooms. And again, I would mow it at its highest level. And I just think it's a great spring to early summer blooming plant because it just really gives a lot. And I love that pink. It looks good with a lot of other colors too. I mean, other plants. The golden groundsel may be one that you haven't heard of before. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see what the plant looks like when it's not blooming, which is most of the year. It's just a nice little, almost a juga-like look to it with these nice ovate dark green leaves. And this is for the shade. Then in the spring, normally it's blooming at this time of year, but it seems to be late this year, probably because we haven't had much water. But it throws up a bloom stalk that gets up to about 2 feet tall, 1 to 2 feet tall, and has these little daisy-like flowers on it. And then when it finishes blooming, if you so choose, you can just take a line trimmer to cut all those blooms back, and you'll have that ground cover for the rest of the year. And it is evergreen. It lasts a long time, spreads well. Direction. Heartleaf skullcap, I talked about the right skullcap. Now this looks a lot different than that one, although the flowers, if you look closely, look very similar. This grows to about 2 feet tall right before it blooms, and then it has these beautiful purplish blue flowers. The leaves are velvety, and it has a nice basal plant during the
And your mic is turned off. And your mic is turned off. You're on mute. There you go.
Oh, okay. Can you now? I hope I wasn't on mute
Yes.
very long.
No, I just.
Okay. Okay. This skull cap is evergreen. In the spring, it starts growing larger up to about 2 feet, and then it blooms with these beautiful little purplish blue flowers, spires of flowers. The leaves are fuzzy gray, so it's another fun plant to pet if you like doing that. And what I normally do is just take a line trimmer or shears and cut it down after it finishes blooming. It will spread either by seed or rhizomes. So to keep it in the area you want, once you've gotten it to the size you want, that's a good idea to trim it. Okay, this is a grass-like ground cover called sedge. This one's cedar sedge, but there's lots of other different sedges out there, and it makes a nice little ground cover in the shade. It's soft. A lot of times in the early spring, I will mow that just to kind of revive it a little bit, but it stays green throughout the year and has this nice soft texture to it. And check out some of the other sedges that might be available at your local nurseries. You can't usually find this at a box nursery, big box nursery. And yarrow. When I was a kid, in that field behind my parents' house, there was lots of this, and I just loved it. Even before the flowers grew, was the base plant, which to me looked like a soft little fern. And then when the flowers come up, you have this bright white little flower, and I love the scent of it too. It's kind of a medicinal scent, and Native Americans used it for different things. But I just like the compound umbel blooms to that. Now you can get other yarrows. The white one is our native one, but you can also get other types of yarrows, the pink, the yellow. I think that yellow one is called moonbeam. The red ones don't seem to keep the pink color as long. It starts turning white after a while, but the yellow ones do seem to keep their color more. Oh, and I forgot to say that the base plant of this is evergreen, so it makes a nice little ground cover and does well in part shade to full sun. Okay, now this you may have seen a lot. You may even have some in your yard and are fighting it with your grass, but instead of fighting it, let it take over in the shaded areas. You can mow it. You can mow it fairly low, or you can keep it at a higher rate, or just not mow it at all. And this is a great one for even little tiny butterflies like the nectar on this plant. The picture where you see a lot of it here with the tree, that was in a wild area, and I wanted to show you how nice it looked without any care at all. But in a home, you can make it look even more like a carpet. So all you have to do is let it go and keep the weeds out. But if you mow it continually or regularly, which means maybe once a month, as opposed to grass, which is once or twice a week, then it will be a nice carpet of green. And this is for the shade. So stop fighting to keep your grass alive in the shade and use something like this. And then there's lyre-leaf sage, another one of the great sages that we've got. This one is evergreen, whereas the one I showed you earlier, the Scarlet Sage, is not. It has these lovely leaves in the fall and winter that have this purple veination to them. You can see in the upper right-hand corner. And then in the spring, it will have a big flush of blooms with a purple flowers, and it has interesting seed stalks too. But if you don't want it to spread, line trim it and keep the seeds out of there. Again, it spreads very well. One of the common names is cancer weed, so that gives you an idea how well it spreads. But I think it's lovely, and it has a great ground cover, leaf cover for when it's not blooming. It doesn't bloom all year long. It just blooms mainly in the spring and then sporadically the rest of the growing season. Then there's violets, wood violets. It comes in this pale to a deep purple color, not purple, but lavender color. And it can cover a yard pretty well. A lot of people like to plant this with horseherb. So you have green almost all year long, because the horseherb will, once it freezes, the leaves disappear. And then the violets have the leaves during the cool part of the year. And then when it starts getting hot, it loses its leaves. But then you have the nice heart-shaped leaves as a ground cover. Frog fruit, here's another great one. It's a low-growing ground cover. It grows by rhizomes and seed and runners. And it has these cute little flowers on them. That's a pretty small flower, but it attracts all kinds of little butterflies and big butterflies. The common Buckeye butterfly that you see in the right-hand corner is one that uses this as a host plant, which means it lays its eggs there. So the caterpillar will come out of its egg and use this to eat. And there's other butterflies that use it as a host plant as well. But this is kind of this is a very tough plant. I've seen it growing at the edge of the roadside on the country roads when I go down to Austin, where it never gets any water. In the middle of summer, it's just doing great right there, right by the asphalt. And here's one you probably haven't seen very much of, that's not used near enough, the snake herb. And it can cover a nice piece of area. You can mow it if you don't like the height. It only gets up to a foot at its tallest, but you can keep it lower. And it has these pretty little purplish flowers on it. Not all the time, just sporadically. And you can see by the green milkweed in the background, that's a pretty short plant. These don't get as tall as it says there, 1 foot. I've only seen it get maybe 8 inches tall. But I don't know what situation it would get a whole foot tall. Okay, and somehow something happened. This should be in the vines, and I don't know what happened to the vines. But anyway, now we're into the vines. Okay, this is a very aggressive plant, so that you should be aware of, but you can keep it under control. You just have to make sure that you're watching it. But you can see by this particular picture on the lower left that it can really cover a fence. That one is a chain link fence, which is great. This was right by a busy street, and I'm sure they wanted to keep it like that so they could have privacy. It's evergreen, so it'll be like that all year long. And it can take some shade too. But in the spring, it has this profuse load of blooms, and it has several different types of colors, where it could be all yellow, or this combination with a yellow on the outside and an orange throat, and this other one that's almost all orange. But it's a great plant for taking over a good size area. Coral honeysuckle. You know, earlier I mentioned Japanese honeysuckle. Well, this is a great vine because it doesn't do what the Japanese honeysuckle does. It's much more tamed. The Japanese honeysuckle can kill a tree just by twining around it, and this one does not. Plus, it's great for nectar for hummingbirds and butterflies. And it's evergreen, so you have some greenery there all year long. I love it. It blooms a lot in the has a flush of bloom in the spring. It might have a few blooms the rest in between spring and August when it blooms again. And it's kind of like it knows the hummingbirds are coming. So that's when it blooms a lot. When the hummingbirds are coming, migrating down to the south, and then when they're coming back up to the north in the fall and late summer. Another cute little vine where the leaves are evergreen, and it has these trumpet star-shaped flowers of yellow. Smells wonderful. Carolina jessamine, not jasmine, but jessamine. But the leaves are these waxy, long, pointed leaves, and it makes a nice fence cover, or it can cover quite a bit of fence too, if you want it to. Not quite as much as the cross vine, but it can cover a fence fairly well, and with these yellow scented flowers in the spring. Okay, I'm sure you've seen this one, Virginia creeper. A lot of people think that this is nuisance, but I really like it. It covers a nice area. You can even use it as a ground cover. It is, it provides nectar, even though you don't see the flowers, they're there. It provides nectar for a lot of different species of moths and butterflies. It provides cover for small critters. And then if it gets a little bit of sun, and the more sun it gets, the redder it gets. In the fall, it turns these lovely colors. So it's deciduous, so think about that as on an arbor or someplace that you might want to cover. And a lot of times you can get it free because it's over somebody's yard that might want to get rid of it. Okay, Texas wisteria. Now, the one that most people are familiar with is the Chinese wisteria. Now, that one is on the invasive list. And not only is it invasive, it's just, it tends to pull on whatever it's supporting it. So if you put it on a weak arbor, or even not so weak arbor, it can pull that arbor down. So that's something to be aware of. This one's not near as destructive as the Chinese wisteria, and it's not invasive. What's different between this one and the Chinese, as far as looks and the flower, mainly is that it flowers. On the Chinese wisteria, the flower comes out before the leaves. On the Texas wisteria, it's also called American wisteria, the leaves come out first and then the blooms. Then after it blooms, it has these neat little pods that come out that look like a big lima bean pod. This picture was taken at the Wildflower Center, if you want to know where it is. Okay, now pipe vine. I put this one in here. It's a nice little vine that is great for the pipe vine swallowtail. The flower itself, you can see the picture there on the right, is not much of a flower. I mean, you don't hardly ever see it. You have to go looking for that flower to find it. But it makes a nice little vine that can cover an archway, but it's great for the pipe vine swallowtail because that's the only plant it uses for its host plant. So that's why I wanted to put this one in there. Then there's the passion flowers. There's all, excuse me, there's several different passion flowers that are native, and then there's a lot of non-native passion flowers. Excuse me. The native incarnata, Passiflora incarnata that you see on the upper left, also called maypop. A lot of people eat the fruits of that. Is similar to another passion flower that looks very much like it, but the leaves are different. The non-native that I'm talking about has a 5-lobed leaf, whereas the native has a 3-lobed leaf. And the non-native is more aggressive than the native. So be aware of that when you're picking out a passion flower. So all of these passion flowers are host plants to the Gulf fritillary butterfly. It lays its eggs on any one of these passion flowers, and that caterpillar that you see in the middle is the Gulf fritillary caterpillar. That one is eating on the Passiflora lutea, which you can see the little bloom there is a pale yellow. What lutea is what it means, yellow in Latin. But that bloom is only about the size of a dime. But it's a nice little plant. If you're not worried about it not being a showy bloom, the plant's easy to grow. And the Gulf fritillary really likes that better than some of the other passion vines. There's also the passion flower fetida. Why they think it smells bad, which is what fetida means, I don't know, because I haven't experienced that. But it looks similar to the incarnata, but the blooms are smaller. And this picture was taken late in the morning, which means you see how it's curling there, the petals are. That's because it only stays open during the morning. And so it's starting to close up there. I prefer, because I'm a night person, not a morning person, to get the incarnata if I was going to get a purple blooming passion flower. But if you're a morning person, you want to see those blooms, that fetida is great. It's also called Corona de Cristo. And the reason is you can see on the seed pod, that's bright red seed pod, looks like a crown of thorns. And I love that seed pod. It's just, that is worth it just for the seed pod. Okay. And that butterfly there is the Gulf fritillary, in case I didn't say that. Now, perennials and biennials. If you don't know what a biennial is, that is a plant that the first growing season, it puts up the plant. In the second growing season, it puts up its flowering parts, and then it dies after it goes to seed. Perennials, it means it goes on year after year after year. Okay. Black-eyed Susans, and they come in different colors. As you can see here, there are a couple of different types that are native. It's the Rudbeckia hirta on the right, and the Rudbeckia fulgida on the left. You may have heard of Goldstrom black-eyed Susan. That's what the one on the far left on the bottom is. But you can get other varieties that have in the nursery trade. These are not natural occurring varieties. They're ones that have been picked to do this. They hybridized them. But they're great, strong plants. The Rudbeckia hirta should be considered a short-lived perennial, or maybe even a biennial, but they don't live near as long. But the Rudbeckia fulgida is a perennial, so it will last year after year. The one thing about the hirta, it seeds out well, and you will have new plants the next year if you let them seed out and drop the seeds. And more yellow flowers, the lance leaf Coreopsis. Just a little plug here. That's our our plant of the season for Native Plant Society. So if you go to local nurseries that are support the Native Plant Society, they should have this available. And again, they come in different varieties with the colors in the center or multi-petaled blooms, but the regular native is just like the single-petaled. It's lance leaf Coreopsis. There's lots of different Coreopsis out there with different colors, but this is a really strong one that will last year to year. And all those other Coreopsis are great too, but this is the native one was one of the first Coreopsis that was introduced in the nursery trade. Okay, this is for a smaller yellow flower, it's Dexmania. It can grow in the shade a little bit. It gets longer in the shade. It doesn't bloom as profusely as some of the other plants, but it blooms in the heat of the summer. It takes heat very well and blooms when a lot of other things aren't blooming at all. And you can trim it back to look more bushy. And in the summer, when it starts looking leggy, even in the sun, you can cut it back almost to the ground and it will come back and start blooming again. Four-nerve daisy. I love this little plant. It can bloom in the shade. I've seen it out at Mineral Wells State Park in deep shade, and they were all over there blooming nicely. But it does best in the sun, in the full sun, and it doesn't take very much water at all. So it's good for your rock garden or to plant with other drought-tolerant plants, which almost all of these plants are drought-tolerant, but some are more so than others. And it's just a bright little bloom, and it can be blooming in the middle of January. So it blooms all year long, but it doesn't bloom constantly. It has a bloom period that'll stop and then bloom again. So that's something to be aware of. Blackfoot daisy is another prolific bloomer. These tiny little white blooms. It also can bloom in the middle of January, and it's a low-growing plant. And as with the four-nerve daisy in this, you keep the blooms trimmed off once they start going to seed, and they'll keep blooming. I just love it. I'm trying to run through these quickly because I have so many. Cali locust, or sundrops, is what they normally call this in the nursery trade. I love this one because of the evergreen foliage. And it looks kind of airy when it's not blooming. And in the winter, it's nice, holds the place nicely. And it has these just bright yellow flowers, mainly in the spring and then sporadically through the rest of the growing season, as well as you can see with Blackfoot daisy. Columbines, the two native ones that you can find around here are the Hinckley's Gold over there on the right, and the Texas Columbine, the red Columbine. Now the red Columbine takes less water, but notice the blooms are quite a bit smaller, but when they're blooming all together, it's a nice little show. And the yellow Columbine, it just brightens up any place. One thing I like about this is the foliage, so that when it's not blooming, it has this nice soft foliage, and it's evergreen. Now in the middle of summer, when it gets hot and it looks raggedy, you just pick up all the dead leaves, chop them off with your pruners, and you'll have a fresh start of greenery shortly thereafter. Pigeonberry. This is a nice, could be considered ground cover as well, but it's a nice low growing plant that's soft. It's great for the shade. It's tough, has flowers and blooms at the same time. And it will, flowers and berries at the same time once it starts blooming. It comes out later than a lot of other things. So in the spring, don't worry if you don't see it coming out when everything else is starting to come. This will come out later. I'd like to tell a story of my sister having plumbing done, and where plumbing worked on. She had a patch of this under her post oak, and lo and behold, that's where the workmen wanted to dig underneath the house. So they put plywood right on top of this, right when the pigeonberry was should have been coming out, and for the spring, and that board was there for about 6 weeks, and I thought, oh, that's dead. But as soon as they were gone, it started coming out and looked just as perky as ever. I was amazed at how well it withstood being tromped on in no light for that period of time during the growing season. I love the berries on this because they're kind of translucent, and when the sun shines through them, they're just pretty spectacular. Okay, frostweed. The reason why it's called frostweed, if you look at the picture on the upper right, when the first frost comes, the stems split and the milky substance inside comes out, and it freezes in these neat little ice formations. And then, of course, when it warms up, they melt away. But that's a real cool thing to see if you can catch it. Now, these will grow pretty tall. They grow taller in the shade, but as you can see on the picture on the left, that's a 6-foot fence, the one on the left, and that one's almost gotten there on the very back. But you can keep them trimmed a couple of times a year. They bloom in the fall, and if you keep them trimmed, they produce more branches there and therefore more blooms. And what's important about this plant is it blooms when the monarchs are headed south to Mexico for their migration, and that this is one of the plants they really like to use for their migration. Okay, purple coneflower. There's the native purple coneflower there that you see. That's a great plant. I'm sure all of y'all seen that. And there's a lot of hybridized coneflowers that are based on that. This one on the left is the Cheyenne Spirit, and it blooms in different colors, all on the same plant, and has all these beautiful colors. I'm going to have to pause here for just a second because I noticed my phone is about to die and I want to get a cord to charge it. I am sorry, y'all. I apologize, y'all. I thought my phone was fully charged. Apparently it wasn't. Okay, only had 5% left. Sorry about that. Okay, as I was saying, the coneflower comes in lots of different colors that if you can go to a nursery and find all kinds of colors, but a lot of them are based on the native Echinacea purpurea. Okay, wine cups. I'm hearing an echo here on my side. I hope y'all aren't. Okay, where was I? Wine cups. These beautiful little guys right here. They have a nice rosette plant that is green most of the year. You can see on the upper right-hand corner. And then in the spring, it will send out these long branches with these purple flowers all over them. and they grow nicely with other plants. They'll grow in between, like mealy blue sage, and here you can see the lantana on the far left and some other plants. And then it blooms for quite a long time, from March through May, and sometimes even June, just depending on where you are in the state. And this is a mowable plant, just like the pink evening primrose. You can put this in there in an area and even put them together and mow them on high, and they will keep producing flowers. This is another essential plant for a lot of butterflies. In particular, the queen butterfly loves this plant, these two plants. You can see the queen butterfly in the top butterfly picture, and that's a little skipper on the lower one. But these are two different plants, even though the flowers look pretty much identical. The blue mist flower grows taller and needs maybe just a little bit more water than the other one, but I haven't found that to be much of a difference. But according to different things I've read, it does. And not only does it grow taller, it stands up straighter. The leaves are different in that the blue mist flower has a darker, pointier leaf with only a slight serration on the edges. And the Greg's mist flower tends to sprawl. It'll get about the same, a little bit lower than the blue mist flower, but it sprawls more. So it's great for like in a pot or on a wall where it can drape down. But both plants just are great for butterflies, and you can see them just attack this plant like crazy when it starts blooming. And this is fall aster. Those are the leaves there on the upper right. It blooms in the fall, and if you cut this back 2 to 3 times before mid-July, you'll have more of a bushy plant and more blooms. You'll note that the leaves, when you trim them back, are a little sticky, so you might want to keep something to whatever you're coming to trim it with. Keep something to wipe your tool with so it doesn't stick so much. I just love this plant, and this always gets a lot of attention. Sorry. Okay. Prairie phlox. This is an early bloomer. Normally it's already blooming by now. Again, just like with the golden groundsel, this year it seems to be late. But it has, as one of the names says, fragrant phlox. It has a just wonderful scent. I mean, you can be yards away and smell it. And it's not icky, sickeningly sweet. It's just a nice flower smell. But it comes in this nice lavender color. Some are a little bit lighter than others. I've seen a really deep color of this and a light color of this, but it mixes well with other plants like the wine cup there. And once it finishes blooming in the spring, it'll go to seed, and if you so wish, you can cut it back because then it starts getting scraggly when it's in the hot season, or you can plant it with something that will cover it up, like Lantana, because it comes up later. Lantana comes up later than this, and it will keep its place. But the leaves are green throughout the cool months, so from fall to May. Now this one's a biennial, it's not perennial. And to keep it going, you can buy a plant at the nursery 1 year and then let it go to seed, and then maybe buy another plant the following year, so you'll have these going every year. But one thing I like about this, it has this neat rosette plant that's green during the winter. It just has interesting foliage there. I just love that. And of course, the flowers are pretty spectacular. And, and as you can guess, this is a big hummingbird attractor as well as other nectar looking, other insects looking for nectar, but particularly hummingbirds. So like I said, the plant itself, I just love it for the winter. It's so different than anything else that's out there during that time. Another plant that's going to might be a little difficult to find in the nursery, but I'll tell you how to get that later. Prairie parsley. It's a parsley. So as you would think anything that eats culinary parsley will eat this. In particular, the black swallowtail. That's the butterfly there and the caterpillar. So it lays its eggs on this plant and eats it. So this is another biennial. So it will have the plant come up the first year, and the second growing season, it will infloresce and have these neat looking golden umbelled flowers. Okay, and here's a pretty standard plant that everybody should have is Mule blue sage. And this comes in different varieties. This one in particular on the right is what we have at the Wildscape. It's called Cedar Hill Mule blue. It's a little bit smaller than the Henry Dewelberg, but it puts out these beautiful blue just like the Henry Dewelberg. Now, most of the Henry Dewelberg has a little bit deeper blue, or then there's the white, the Augusta Dewelberg. These bloom for a long period of time, and if you cut them back during when they start looking scraggly in the summer, they'll come back up for the fall and have another nice bloom period. Okay, milkweed's another very important plant in our ecosystems. There's lots of different kinds, but these right here are, okay, the green milkweed, the one up in the right-hand corner, and the antelope horns milkweed, which the blooms look very similar. There's a little bit of difference between them. But the leaves, you can see the big difference in the leaves. The green milkweed stands more upright, has a more ovate leaf, whereas the antelope horns lays down a little bit more once it gets to a certain height and has long, skinny, pointed leaves. And the blooms look very, very much alike. And then there's the Texas milkweed that comes more from, I think it comes more from East Texas. It likes a little bit of shade in the afternoon. So morning sun, yes, but not afternoon sun. And butterfly weed, the orange one, the tuberosa, it's a great plant. It's one of the easier ones to grow, but it doesn't have as much of the chemical that monarchs need. But they will still use it if there's no other milkweeds around. But just know that you're not going to get near as much as if you use these other milkweeds. These are all native milkweeds that I'm showing here. The Texas milkweed is one of the easier ones to grow too, but make sure you put it where it doesn't get afternoon sun. The green milkweed and the antelope horns, they need full sun pretty much. Although I think the antelope horns can use a little bit less sun. The other milkweed that you see a lot is the tropical milkweed. It grows very tall. It's orange and usually yellow, orange and yellow flowers. It's a good one, but make sure you cut that back at the end of September. Cut it down because there is a disease that they're still not sure, they're still being investigated, whether or not it transmits a disease to the monarchs, which then, when they get it, in turn brings it back to where they overwinter, and kills the monarch. So we don't want that to happen. So make sure you cut it down if you're using the tropical milkweed. Okay, and now these are non-natives, and the zinnias that I've shown here are annuals as well. They're the only annuals, and the Gerber daisy, Gerbera daisy are the only ones that I put in here that are not, that are annual. But these grow very well. The tropical plumbago, of course, a lot of people like that because it's such a beautiful blue. There's not a whole lot of blue flowers that you can find. And those are several different colors of the profusion zinnias, which I personally like because they have a nice kind of mounded shape. They're so super easy to grow. They don't require hardly any water. And the Gerber daisy is another great plant down there, comes in several different colors. The other plant that is native that's in this pot is the silver ponyfoot. And that comes in, I believe, the hill country is where it's from. And it's great as a ground cover, as the spiller, as you will, for a pot. It's just a nice little ground cover. And if you happen to want to use it in a pot, what I did was got one 4-inch pot, and there was enough in that pot that I could divide it into 3 pieces and put it in different pots, and it grew crazily. So don't spend a lot of money buying it, because it grows very quickly and abundantly. There's a lot of other annuals out there that are great too, but these are the ones I like to use for some of my customers that like pots covered in blooms. Okay, then there's also gazanias, which comes from Africa. So it doesn't need very much water at all. Another one that should be considered annual. Let's see, and also the Mexican sunflower is also an annual. But the gazanias I like because they have these interesting patterns to them, and there's all different kinds. The Mexican sunflower is kind of a bush that grows up in 1 year, and it has these just gorgeous orange blooms. I think there's some other colors out there, maybe deeper reds, but they're just very vibrant, and they take very little water. And be careful not to put them in an area where it gets too humid, because they will develop powdery mildew if you do that. So get it in a nice area where it gets plenty of air. Then over here is a oxblood lily, also called schoolhouse lily, because they bloom in September when traditionally school would be starting. But there's like a little amaryllis. So there are lots of other different bulbs too that do well here. There are a few tulips that can do well here, but they're particular ones. And if you want bulbs, there is a company called Southern Bulb. You can find them online. They have all the bulbs that do well in this area, and I encourage you, if you like bulb flowers, to check them out. They're a great family-owned company. Okay, now where to get these? There's lots of ways to get them. Native Plant Society, NIPSOT, Native Gardens, and Master Gardener all have plant sales throughout the year. So check your local social media. And there's also in Dallas, in McKinney, Herd Museum also puts on a good plant sale. So check those out. And check out close by Master Gardener places that, not places, what am I saying? Chapters that have them. Denton has a Master Gardener chapter, and so does Dallas. So check them and see when they have theirs out. And a lot of them include native plants. But also Native Plant Society, when they find out a place is going to be bulldozed, they will try to ask the owner if we can rescue plants. So keep an eye out on that. You can look on their website or on their Facebook pages that's a good way to do it. Plus, you meet other people that are interested in it and can help you identify them. And there are local gardens that have volunteers that take care of those gardens. So that's another good way to get plants, because when they're overrun with a particular plant that are going out of their beds, they'll share their plants with you, and it's a good way to learn. And then there's other native plant enthusiasts. If you know people that are into native plants, most of them are willing to share. The nursery trade is getting smarter about carrying native plants, especially the last few years when we've had more droughts and people's exotics die. They want to get plants that are more drought tolerant. So my suggestion is to go more to the local nurseries than the big box nurseries. They're more likely to have them, although big box nurseries do have some. The local nurseries have them more. There's Stiegel's Nursery over off of, it's just outside of Fort Worth, off of, can't think of the name of the street, but you can look them up. Stiegel's Nursery. They're not too far away from Weston Gardens, which is on Anglin Drive off of 820 and I-20. They have a lot of native plants. But if you look on the Fort Worth chapter of Native Plant Society, there is a page that tells you other nurseries that sell native plants. And if you want to learn more about native plants, you can take an NLCP class, which stands for Native Landscaping Certification Program. Native Plant Society puts that on. You look on their website, it'll tell you where they are and which, there are like different stages of classes. You have to take the first one in order to take the second one. And the first two ones you have to take in order to take any of the other subsequent ones. But after that, you can take the others out of order. If you look on the state chapter, it'll tell you all the ones in the whole state, where they are and when. And it will give you links on where to sign up. Then if you also join a local chapter of the Native Plant Society, like I mentioned, the North Central chapter, which is the Fort Worth, Tarrant County chapter, that you can learn a lot. You don't have to know anything. In fact, we want people that don't know anything and that want to learn. If you join our chapter and it's the first time you join the Native Plant Society, you actually get a free book. There's 2 books, and I don't remember which 2 books they are at this point, but you look on their website, it should tell you. And check out books. The Native Texas Plants Landscaping Region by Region by the Wasowskis is a great book, because it gives you lots of information about where they came from, what their needs are, how to take care of them, and it's in a good order. She also gives examples of designs. That's a very good, especially starter book, because this was written 20 some odd years ago, and since then native plant interests have grown, and there are a lot more native plants out there than were available at the time that book was written. Another book, Bringing Nature Home, is a good one, because it explains why our native plants are important for our ecosystems. And it's not just important to birds, bees, etc. It's important to us because it affects us as well. And then one of the best ways to learn is by volunteering at a public native garden. This is at the Molly Holler Wildscape, but there are quite a few other native public gardens, so check those out, and they'll be glad to accept you into the fold. And I don't know about the other places, but at Molly Holler, it doesn't matter if you come every single workday, or just an hour for the workday, or just show up once a month. Anytime you come out, we are glad to have you and help and help teach you, as well as have you do the work with us. Okay, another place to learn is a wildflower.org. That's a Ladybird Johnson wildflower site, and it has lots of information. You can look up plants by common name or by botanic name, as well as look up lists of types of plants or regions by the region. So that's a great source. And if you're on Facebook, Texas Flora is a Facebook page. If you join it, you have to be accepted, but you can look on it no matter if you're joined or not. If you're joined, you can actually post, but if you're not a member, you can just look at it and learn a lot. It is a wonderful place to learn because there's all kinds of people on that site that don't know anything to people who are experts. And this covers the whole state of Texas. So there are people all the way out in Amarillo to Big Bend area down to the tip of southeast tip of Texas. And it's neat to look what's out there besides what's in our own area. And then this is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me with any questions you may have, or to hire me if you'd like to have a design.